My mother took me to the Greyhound bus depot in Indianapolis. She, at the time, had never been outside of Ohio, Indiana, or one brief trip to Texas. Nonetheless, her advice to me was don't forget to look up. I still haven't forgotten that, and I still crane my neck to look at skyscrapers every day. Some people mistaken me for a tourist, but I always wonder why people keep their eyes to the ground even after only 6 months of living here. They forget the vertical majesty of the city.
Today we have Daniel Golliher, the founder of Maximum New York. It's actually three things: a civics institution, a game, and a set of ideas. Accordingly, Maximum New York has three goals: train talent to enter the civic sphere, make it as enjoyable as learning any other worthwhile skill, and deploy that talent in the service of human capacity and well-being by growing New York City. Prior to starting Maximum New York, Daniel wrote 3 books, worked as a barista in Cincinnati, and navigated the legal world through a law firm. Daniel, welcome to the pod. Really excited to have you here. Just for some context, it would be great to understand your upbringing, how you got into government, politics, all that. I know, speaking for myself, it was not something that I was born eager to dive into, and now I've been fascinated and curious about learning more about it. So would love to hear your story.
I grew up on a farm in Indiana, and interestingly, I largely grew up without internet until high school. And when I tell this to people on the coasts who are my age, it's a little bit shocking because internet and high-speed internet, which we used to call DSL, came to the coasts by the early aughts, and we had barely gotten dial-up by that point. But in any case, all of my childhood was still lived in books, and large part throughout high school was still lived completely through books. And although I wouldn't have used this language at the time, I would have noticed that everyone has the potential to be interested in a particular kind of systems problem. For some people, that's coding. For some people, that's architecture. Almost anything can be analyzed as a system if you want. Even cooking can as well, although there's more chaos there. And the system that I was very much interested in was the law and government. That is a lot of what I read about, and it was the kind of media that I enjoyed consuming. But although I wouldn't have used the word systems analysis at the time. But we all have that little corner of our brain that loves a good system, and government has always been mine. And after I graduated high school, I attended Harvard College, and my undergraduate degree was in government. But I had a little bit of a difficult time in undergrad for a variety of reasons, but 2 principally. One, the undergraduate program, which this is not exclusive to Harvard, was structured as an a la carte menu. And I think we recognize in other subjects like mathematics, there's a proper order to learn things. First, you learn the basic 4 arithmetic functions, and then you proceed on up to calculus and then pass to more complex fields. I do also think the same is true of government and law, but the government program was not structured that way and just sort of assumes, oh, you're a smart person, you know how to guide yourself. And that's just not true. If you were to ask most graduates of Harvard's government programs, and I would assume most government or political science programs in most colleges, most people have forgotten what they learned. They never really learned it in an integrated fashion, and they certainly don't actually know how the government works. The only knowledge that they do have is acquired in an ad hoc fashion through work. Either that or through law school, which itself doesn't even prepare individuals to go into, say, city and state government. You don't get any rigorous treatment of how those things work there either. And I know this because I've had lawyers in my class. So in the class that I teach, which we'll get into. So when I was an undergrad, I just realized these people don't know how the government works. I'm in a program that does not really teach that. So if I want that knowledge, I have to acquire it for myself. And that was a little bit disillusioning. I didn't wind up going into government immediately after I graduated. I thought I was either going to do that or go to law school right after graduation. Instead, I began a very long and meandering course of figuring out what I wanted to do on God's green earth. And so I did a lot of things. I continued my term time job working in Harvard's gyms for the first year after I graduated. Then I became a corporate paralegal to see if I wanted to go to law school. As it turns out, no, I do not. And then I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. I worked as a barista. I finished my 3rd book at the time, which is called Dear Wayne County. It's a short memoir about where I grew up. I moved back to Boston, worked in a gym again, and then I went back to the same law firm, that time on their PR team. And then that's what allowed me to eventually move to New York City, where I am now. And during the pandemic, I left my job at that law firm to finally start working on Maximum New York, which is to say to start full time the rigorous legal investigatory and research process that resulted in a school curriculum. Because I realized smart people all throughout the city, and I had seen this earlier in college, quite simply don't know how it works, and they don't even know how to learn it. So if I want to live in a society that has a ready on-ramp for smart, kind, ambitious people into the civic sphere, I would have to create it, largely. That's the summary.
That's amazing. I love that you're teaching a course. It's always great to have teachers on the podcast because I find you just have a great way of articulating concepts and thoughts. And going back to teaching, I'm really curious because I think in college we gain a lot of a theoretical approach to a skill or a body of knowledge. Certainly for Matt and I, we both studied computer science. You gain at Berkeley a very theoretical approach to something that can be just very applied in actual software engineering. So I'm curious, how did you decide to go into government at Harvard, and how well do you think it prepared you for the real world?
Well, I suppose it depends on which corner of the real world. I do think I had a good degree program, but that there's survivorship bias there. It's in spite of the way that the school was structured, not because of it. So I went into government because I just loved it. I think it's the most fascinating thing in the world. Political philosophy, political history, the way we structure things now. That's why I did it. I could come up with other reasons that I can broadcast backward onto myself, but it's just true that I was fascinated and continue to be fascinated by it. And it prepared me for, I wouldn't say it prepared me for the real world in that my degree didn't easily allow me to easily figure out what I wanted to do. It didn't do that, although I don't think most degrees do that for a lot of people. I think the three of us maybe were in a little bit of the same boat there. What it did do is give me a very broad and deep knowledge of political history and the Western and philosophical canon. And again, that is in spite of the way that the school was set up, which is as an a la carte menu without any order, any sense of a proper order in which you should take things for the most part. I did have some professors who were extremely good mentors who helped guide and structure my program, but I don't think most students did have that kind of hands-on assistance. So I think the very deep knowledge of history and the Western canon has become extremely useful because once you get outside of college, it's very hard to dedicate the sheer amount of hours necessary to acquaint yourself with that volume of material. So in that way, it was incredibly useful because that historical and theoretical context is now very useful in tandem with applied knowledge. So I'm really glad that I'm not trying to backfill all the history and philosophy at the same time as I'm teaching how to do things or how things actually are structured. So in that way, it was useful. But in terms of finding a job, no, I was lost for the better part of 5 to 10 years before I landed on what I'm doing now. But that's regular.
Yeah. I think in order to make the most of this conversation and so that we all can sort of, well, Abe and I have been trying to brush up as much as we can, but I think
I
it'd
read
be
the
helpful.
Constitution last night, by the way.
It would be great to have just some working definitions so that way we don't interchange words when we shouldn't. I think it would be helpful to hear your definition of a few words: government, politics, law, or types of law, and any other useful terms that you find that you have to sort of educate us folks.
Yeah, I think you hit three that I usually talk about in addition to the word civics. So for me, politics, and there are a lot of different systems of thought that define these words in a lot of different ways, but here are the ones that I use in a way that I think is sensible. Politics just means social rulemaking. So wherever there are two or more people, there is a politics. So there are politics in a friend group. Those are made socially, and the rules that politics produces are just called norms of the friend group, largely negotiated in person or in a group chat or something. And a workplace has politics. We're familiar with the phrase workplace politics. Those are negotiated via norm, but they also have a form of codification, usually like an employee handbook in HR. And there are also governmental politics. Those are special because the rules that they make are called laws and we're all subject to them. So most people, when they use the word politics, conflate all different kinds of politics into one word and it gets very confused. I think when most people say the word politics, what they actually mean is governmental politics. And that is related to, but distinct from, workplace politics, friend group politics, etc. And the last thing I'll say about that word is it is not a bad word. I talk about a thing called the anti-politics meme, which is where individuals via their speech use the word politics only as a synonym for bad. They don't actually mean anything by it, just bad. So the quintessential example, or one of them, is when someone calls a process very political, especially a hiring process. They'll say, oh, I wasn't hired, or this meritorious person was not hired. It was a completely political process. And I always think, you don't have to drag politics into this. Like, leave poor politics alone. What you actually mean is it was nepotistic or something. There's an actual word there that you want. You're just using politics as a bad word. But social rulemaking is neutral. You can do well with it or do poorly, do it for good, do it for bad. So civics is the sum total of all overlapping politics in a city. So the civic realm is just all the friend group politics overlap with workplace politics, overlap with governmental politics, that sort of thing. So civics is just an aggregative term, in my view. It subsumes all relevant politics in a bounded geographic area. Relatedly, government is an institution that has a monopoly on the use of legal force over a given geographic area. So at its base, I just consider government to be, it is legalized force to make and enforce laws that we have to obey. And it's bounded by some geography. And that comes finally to the word law. And I think you can be simple about it. Again, lots of philosophers have a lot of different definitions for this term, but they're just legal rules. Rules we must obey at ultimate threat of state violence. No more, no less. So, but again, in the United States, there are 4 kinds of law, distinguished by who makes them. So we have constitutional law, law that emanates from these written documents that are supreme in their jurisdiction. Next, we have statutory law, which is law that's made by legislative bodies. So that would be Congress together with the president, New York City Council together with the mayor, the New York legislature, which is our assembly and senate, together with the governor. After statutory law, you have administrative law. And I think this one is the first time where most people realize how much they've been tricked or how much they've not realized. Because administrative law is law that is issued by things like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Food and the FDA or the state or the federal DOT, all these agencies that they've heard of. I don't think most people have a clear idea what exactly they do, but they issue law just like Congress does. It's on a piece of paper that has a process that you have to follow, and then we're all subject to it, just like anything else. So administrative law is their rules, also called regulations, same thing, that these entities issue. And then finally, there's case law, which is law that's contained within judicial opinion. So most people are familiar with the Supreme Court doing this or that, interpreting the law to say X, Y, or Z. Case law just lives there. So in summary, that is politics, civics, government, and law. And they really do have specific definitions. They do have interrelations, but for most people, they just exist as a hazy cloud in their head. And if you can't get past that hazy cloud, it's really impossible to apprehend the field.
Thank you for giving us the basic vocabulary to then launch into the rest of this podcast. That's really important. I certainly have never thought about those terms in their actual definitions or even a defined way. So this is awesome. I think there's a lot of listeners here today who would want to obtain a more than basic understanding of the law. I think a lot of those same listeners, I'll just use myself for example, maybe get too many push notifications from Wall Street Journal, hear too many opinions said on the street, but have a lack of actual first principles understanding from the source of what government is and how to be involved. So now that we know the vocabulary, what would you say is some of the foundations and the basics of politics and governance that are topics that we should discuss today you could educate the general public about?
Well, I think the first thing to do for most people, just when they're walking around listening to what people think, is ask yourself in your heart, do I actually understand? Can I imagine the on-the-ground process that is producing these things that I'm hearing about? And how sharp is that picture in my head? And to me, that's the most reliable thing that people can do to see if they understand really any subject, but politics especially. But to answer your question, I think there are a couple of chief organizing frames that help people grip the field quickly. One is just answering the question, what is the law? Which we already did. There's 4 kinds. And those 4 kinds exist at each level, federal, state, and then local, although it gets more highly idiosyncratic at the local level. So you also know at each level, there is a corresponding entity. Like we have a federal constitution, a state constitution, And local governments have a version of these, but again, it's a little bit more idiosyncratic. So what is the law? And number two, I think this would surprise most people, answering the question, what is a corporation? So I think most people conflate corporation with thing that makes money, monopoly man. That's what's vaguely floating in their head. If anyone is in the business world, they of course know there are multiple kinds of corporation, and they can tell you about S corps, C corps, limited partnerships, limited liability partnerships. The list goes on. There's actually many different ways to do this. Nonprofits are also a kind of corporation. But then you start to encounter things like municipal corporations, which is what New York City is. And once you get to that point, then you should start to think to yourself, wait a minute, New York City is a corporation? The answer is yes. Is it the same or different than, say, a C corp? And it is much more similar than you would imagine. So a corporation is just a legal agglomeration of at least one regular person or one natural person like us. And this legal person of a corporation has rights and responsibilities, or it's a bundle of contracts. So instead of thinking of a corporation as a monopoly man with dollar signs for eyes, you should just think of it as a social technology. And that will help you make sense of your city. So you'll hear about municipally owned corporations. Well, New York City can charter corporations just like you and I can. Anyone can go to the Delaware Secretary of State and get a Delaware corporation if they want. That's true of municipal corporations and of the state government too. They also make corporations. And a lot of our government is that kind of entity. So what is the law? What is a corporation? Those two are probably the most important questions people can answer for themselves. But the last one is just asking people, can you draw a map of your government? There's a kind way to do this and an unkind way to do this. It just depends on where the conversation has gone. But often someone will have very strong opinions about how the government works. And if you suggest to them that they should be able to draw a map of the government, almost inevitably they just can't. They have no idea where to start. They have no idea what that looks like. So people should ask themselves, can I do that? And if they can't, which most people can't, then they should ask themselves, well, what are my opinions based on then, really? And the answer is they're not really based on anything. If you could freeze their mind and like open it up, it's just a mishmash of internet memes and fuzzy clouds and that sort of thing. So the two questions I brought up at the beginning, what is the law? What are corporations? Those are important, but in many ways, those are already a little bit too complex. The way to get right at it is draw me a map of the government.
Given that it seems like we've mostly been talking in neutral states, but you have essentially dedicated your entire career life to enacting positive change in how you see fit, I'm sure you have a particular set of beliefs and guiding principles on how you think we can improve government and the political system. So it'd be great to understand your vision for Maximum New York and, when relevant, maybe some of your own beliefs as well.
Well, the guiding vision of Maximum New York is bring more minds online. So imagine you only had, the example I always give, which maybe you had encountered before the podcast, is imagine there were only 5 software engineers or 5 people who knew how to code. We would not have the technologically advanced civilization that we have today, because that's just not very many minds to produce that much output. Even if they were all brilliant, they're limited just by the very low the very low number of them. But if you get 100 software engineers, and then 1,000, and then 10,000, and then hundreds of thousands, which we have now, I don't actually know how many software engineers there are in the United States. I assume it's a 6-figure number. I don't actually know. That might be too high. But in any case, there are emergent qualities and network effects to having that many minds who understand the same problem all working together. So a lot of the coordination is emergent. It doesn't have to be directly done. And so a lot of software problems are solved. And I think the same lens is useful when thinking about government. So we do, of course, have a lot of people who understand how small parts of it work. And we have a lot of people who've dedicated their entire lives to government who do know how it works. But in the grand scheme of things, we don't actually have that many people who have a model of the whole system. We are kind of in the 5 software engineers. We're closer to that end of things in government than most people would realize. So my general proposition is, before we do anything else, especially in New York City, more people need to know how it works. because it's impossible for kind, smart, ambitious citizens with resources to properly coordinate toward the future of the city if they don't know how it works. So Maximum New York's first goal is bring more minds online, network them together, and then reap the benefits of emergent coordination that can happen as a result of that. And that's why I have the classes. That's why I have the school. And one of the concrete policies that I pursue individually, and that I think most people, after they finish the class, they agree that it's a proper policy to propose, is housing abundance. So most people know we have a housing shortage in the United States. But if they know that, they don't exactly know numerically, what does that mean? How many do we need? How do we get them? Or even, as I talk about, if you're entering a policy domain, you should just know what its parameters are. So for New York City, you have people who say we're in a housing crisis, and then they jump immediately to how we should solve it. And they have all kinds of ideas. But my first question is, well, how many housing units do we have in the first place? So before you get to the ought, just nail down what is. How many housing units do we have? What kind are they? How old are they? Mastering that realm of things, which informs proper policy decisions when you're looking at what ought to be, is harder than most people think, and they generally skip right over it. So the policy prescriptions they wind up advocating for are not as sharp as they should be, or are often deleterious. So there's like 3.6 million housing units in New York City. I don't think most people even know what that number, I don't think most people would have ever guessed that. And when I ask most people, they don't guess anything close to it. So then you would ask, well, how many do we need? So you can see how the ought evolves very naturally from the is, but you do first have to grasp the is. And so after Bring More Minds Online, the second animating force behind Maximum New York is master what is before reaching for what ought to be. And if you only ever reach for ought, I just call that getting caught in the is-ought political trap. But in any case, housing is wrapped up in all of this. I just like philosophy's queen of the sciences, I regard housing as queen of the policies, because its effect and how well things are going in that domain just have incidental ramifications that are incredibly deep in almost every other policy area. So I want to have more housing in New York City and do what needs to be done to allow New York City to have an elastic housing market. And for me, that means having a vacancy rate somewhere between 5 and 10%. And, you know, in the best possible case, producing at least 100,000 new units of housing per year, if that's what supply and demand require to become balanced.
Rewinding just a little bit, you moved to New York on February 1st, 2019. So
that's right.
About 4 years and 6 months in.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who recently came to the realization of, I want to be based in New York, at least for the next several years, I'm really curious how you first decided to come to New York, what's kept you here the last 4.5 years, and also what was your journey to realize you were fully committed? Because when we talked, and because you have Maximum New York, it seems like you've pretty much committed to New York. So I'm curious in that entire personal journey with your relationship to New York.
I was very confident I would like to live here when I was 15, because that's when I came here for the first time for a national competition for a parliamentary procedure in high school. You can see the government influence goes way back. So it was the standard story. My mother took me to the Greyhound bus depot in Indianapolis. I got on the bus, and she at the time had never been outside of Ohio, Indiana, or one brief trip to Texas. Nonetheless, her advice to me was, don't forget to look up, because she knew me very well. And so I got on the bus, and then I arrived in New York City, and I still haven't forgotten that. And I still crane my neck to look at skyscrapers every day. Some people definitely have mistaken me for a tourist, but I always wonder why people so quickly keep their eyes to the ground even after only 6 months of living here. They forget the vertical majesty of the city. But in any case, I got here when I was 15. I immediately fell in love with the built environment, as I knew I probably would, because I'd read about it in books and seen all the pictures. And I did my parliamentary procedures competition. I saw Hairspray on Broadway, which was another transformative experience. I hadn't ever really known music could be like that. And, remember, at this time, this makes me sound like I'm 1,000 years old, but I'm just barely over 30. I couldn't stream unlimited music over the internet. I had CDs, but that was it. And this was really the first time I'd heard a musical. So in the audience, couldn't stay in my seat. I had what I describe as a good panic attack, such an overwhelming tidal wave of emotion I will never forget. And that I also learned about the existence of the musical Wicked while I was here. And then that just sent me off on a whole thing when I got back. So after that trip, I was reasonably confident that I would like New York City. And as an adult, that never went away. But I didn't want to live here while I was very poor. So as I highlighted earlier, I made a lot of life decisions that forewent any particularly remunerative opportunities because I didn't enjoy them, quite honestly, and because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life. So I largely orbited around Boston, which is a great place to be poor, I think. It's a university town, so it's very used to catering to students without a ton of money, despite the high housing costs. So I had a great time in Boston, although I definitely had no money. And when I finally did get my first well-paying job, which is when I went back to the law firm, that's when I went to New York immediately. And in fact, in the interview process for that job, I said specifically, I would like to move to the New York office as soon as possible. So as the day that I got here, February 1st, 2019, it clicked, it fit like a glove. It has only ever felt that way more and more every passing day, even during the pandemic. It fits me perfectly.
Wow.
So anyway, I think everyone should strive to find a place that fits them like this. I think to the last part of your question, when did I commit or how did I commit, something like that? Looking back, I can see that it was from day one, but that it's always a process that you have to grow into. But I firmly believe people should look at the decision of where to live the way that they should look at finding a life partner or marriage. It's one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. And it is wrong to view it fundamentally as a loss of optionality. Because while technically it does require commitment and foregoing other options, like other partners or living in other places, I think about those kinds of those are good constraints. They free you to set down roots. They free you to not worry about who your teammate is. And then they also give you a ton. In marriage, you get a teammate that you can reap the compounding returns of teamwork with over time. And if you live in a city, then you can actually integrate into a social network if you commit. I do know people who've lived in places for decades and they've never committed. And so they don't know any of their neighbors. That's very strange, but commitment is magic. As soon as you do it, you will know your neighbors. You're not going to be a New Yorker who doesn't know who they live next to, that sort of thing.
I love that. Taking your monogamous relationship with New York City just one step further.
Mm-hmm.
I think as with any relationship, you have hardships and you have great times. You have things to overcome. So what would you say, going back, I think a lot of people have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the city. You have both the abundance and all the things to be able to do, but the high prices and the overall just like intensity of the rhythm here. And so I'm curious if you have a love-hate part about the New York City, and then taking that one step further, what are some things that are posing the most significant challenges for the city that you think we should be addressing in the coming years?
Well, I will maybe challenge the frame of that a little bit because it is definitely true that a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with the city for reasons that are good and proper. I do think, though, many people have a dissatisfactory relationship with the city for reasons that are entirely their fault and are unexamined, and they are projecting incorrect decisions of their own onto the city, which they would do anywhere. This is not unique to New York. For example, the money thing. I have a couple of YouTube videos I made on this as soon as I moved here because I had Midwestern relatives who always said, "Oh, it's so expensive there. How's it going? Like, doesn't a box of cereal cost $8?" And it's true that housing is expensive here. There's no getting around that. But everything else can be had very affordably, and there are more things here that are cheap or free than anywhere else in the country. So as long as you're of temperate comportment and a little bit patient, you can see that we are in fact surrounded by cheap and free options for almost anything, and that those prices are almost, if not directly, on par with things throughout the country. For example, if you want cheap food, go to Trader Joe's, but not just Trader Joe's, Key Foods, or we have City Target, or get a Costco membership because we have a Costco in Manhattan, or the list goes on and on. Cheap food is cheap, high quality, abundant food is here and is even within walking distance. So there are a lot of people who do not wisely spend their money, but that is not the city's fault. So I always say, like, New York City for food, for example, has every price point you could possibly imagine, from $0 up to infinity. Many other places have a much narrower price band. So when they look at New York and think it's expensive, what's actually happening is they're being startled by how far the price band goes up. And they're so blinded that they don't look at the bottom of the ladder, which is very, very much extant here. So in any case, I will not deny that New York has its expensive elements, but I do think people can live here much more affordably than they think. But it's up to them. But that's true anywhere.
I'm on a quest to do that while I'm on sabbatical.
Yeah, I mean, it's very doable. 8.5, 9 million people live here. Not everyone is a millionaire, so either all those people are living in squalor, or maybe this city is more affordable than people think. I think if they would just take a step back, if most people would just take a step back, they'd realize that the city has much more affordable options in many spending categories than you might suspect. So in any case, all that said, the things that are challenging about the city, the first one I think is just undoubtedly housing. So the housing is expensive, but it's not just that. It is administratively difficult to get, and more administratively difficult to get than possibly anywhere. So if you try to rent an apartment, there's a lot of paperwork you have to submit. And having rented apartments in Ohio and Massachusetts, and talking to people all over the country, it's just not this way everywhere. The amount of paperwork you have to submit, the way you have to deal with brokers, it's a giant administrative hurdle. And there are a lot of other things that go along with housing that are bundled up in there. For example, New York's housing stock is uniquely old. 71% of our residential buildings were built before 1951. That's very old. New Yorkers should actually be quite alarmed that the desirable buildings are pre-war, and they're not talking about World War II. So that's very old. And they should, so a lot of things that are synonymous with New York culture, like the leaky, loud radiator, the elevatorless walk-ups, all these things that you associate with dilapidated buildings, that's because our buildings are really old. And the thing that makes our buildings old, those are the same laws that also largely illegalize building. So these are all different symptoms of the same cause, but it causes New Yorkers to experience housing problems in a panoply of ways, even though they largely only share the same legal source. So housing is probably the largest challenge for me, for my friends, finding ways to live together, live near each other, live well, that sort of thing. And, the last thing I'll say is everyone will always talk about the benefits of urban agglomeration and the effects of scale in a city, not just in labor markets, but in arts and entertainment, in ways you can consume, in ways you can build, because it's so easy to find a co-founder or something. Things scale quite well in a city. So do bad things. So what I always say is, I grew up in rural Indiana. So if you had a weird dude that lived, by himself in a house or in a trailer out in the middle of nowhere, if he was weird in any way, or if he was disturbed, or, if he likes to run around in his yard and yell to no one in particular, that's just going to affect him. He's out in the woods. You put that same person in New York City, now all of a sudden he's affecting thousands and thousands of people. You put him in a subway car, now you're actually making people very fearful, and they're wondering, what am I supposed to do here? So good things scale in a city, but so do harms, and so do negative externalities. So that is inherent to any city, but it is especially inherent to New York, which is our densest and therefore most scale-friendly city.
Earlier you mentioned that housing is the queen of policies, I think is what you said.
Yes.
Maybe before to answer this question, it would be helpful for you to talk about why government is a complex adaptive system and what that even means, and then maybe segue that into why is housing in the center of all this, and why does good housing lead to solving all the other downstream problems, and why, if we have a huge shortage of housing, that leads to a lot of trickle-down problems as well.
So this is a housing podcast, eh? So government is so maybe we can chunk that out, and you'll have to remind me about the different parts. The first one is government is a complex adaptive system. So so if I were to render that in other words, it would be government is a large system with many subsidiary parts with unique attributes that act and interact and produce emergent phenomena or qualities that are greater than the sum of all the parts. They're not sets of behaviors that you would initially predict from all of your starting conditions or all of your initial subsidiary parts. So weather is also like this. So this is what I think of when I think of a complex system. Subsidiary parts, emergent phenomena as you move up the layers of consideration. Adaptive because, well, I hope it's adaptive anyway. Sometimes complex systems are not, and they collapse like matchsticks. But it's adaptive, or at least New York City's is, because it responds to change and alters itself in the face of that change. Parts of the city government are very sclerotic and they don't respond this way. Other parts are. The largest example that I usually talk about in the class that I teach is in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the central component of New York City's government. It was a thing called the Board of Estimate. And at the time, newspapers like the New York Times, etc., they were apoplectic and panicking, saying the city's going to fall apart. The boroughs are all going to break away from the city and become independent cities again. This is the end of New York City as we know it, because this is the only government that the city had ever known. How can you just get rid of its central governing body and expect it to go on? In fact, in anticipation of this outcome, the mayor, with his charter commission, drafted a completely revised charter, and then it was fine. As it turns out, government has a lot of capacity, and it can actually manage this kind of adaptation if it wants to. So it's not all bad news. That said, Staten Island in 1993 did vote to secede. And as a result of this, because they lost a lot of power relative to the other boroughs with the reconfiguration of government, and they were only stopped from leaving by the state legislature for the most part. So there's actually a new secessionist flare-up happening right now over congestion pricing. So I don't know, there's always secessionist tendencies bubbling in the background in Staten Island, but not just Staten Island. Queens also made an epic run for it too, although that didn't work out. So far, none of them have. So that's what I mean by complex adaptive system. I think the key thing that most people would do well to mark there is the emergent qualities and the surprise ramifications of perturbing the system in at least simple ways. That might, butterfly effect itself into something that you wouldn't have anticipated.
I think you've talked a little bit about like good guy, bad guy, looking to the gods for answers for why things are the way they are. How does someone begin to look past that and start to think more critically about those kinds of regulations or policies that actually inform or actually result in the community, the housing, what they see in front of them in their local communities?
So I think you're referring to an essay that I wrote that's something called like Slay Your Political Gods or something like that. So most people, I don't know how large the fraction is, and anecdotally, certainly around my neck of the woods, but also just in my entire experience as an adult in this country, most people think the bad thing happened because the bad person wanted it to happen politically. The good thing happened because my political hero bravely stood up and made it happen. And you, of course, do have people that act heroically and people who act badly. I'm not denying that. It's just that usually the explanations are not, they don't resemble these fights between epic titans for good and evil. They just have more anodyne explanations like the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure is piled on top of the State Environmental Quality Review Act is piled on top of, et cetera. So for most people to get past it, usually, so I have a set of things, questions, observations that I offer to people that are hopefully model breaking. So most people have an implicit model of how politics works, and many of them are using this God-based model. epic good guy, epic bad guy. And so I just offer things that should break those models and allow people to get to a point where they think, oh, well, I can't deny that thing he just said. Let me look a little closer into what actually goes on here. So, I mean, I have a couple of these. I do emphasize city and state politics. I do think people need to focus on that for the most part, but I usually offer federal examples because that's what most people are familiar with. So at the federal level in 2020, there was a Supreme Court case that wildly expanded the rights of LGBTQ people. And if I say that, people are like, oh, it was probably the judges on the left who managed to get that case, and they're probably the ones who wrote the opinion. But it is a Republican Trump appointee, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote that opinion. And in fact, it's a conservative Supreme Court that came to this ruling. So to say nothing about the rest of the court, the existence of that Bostock v. Clayton County, the existence of that case alone should be enough to shatter most people's models of how they think the government works. And again, I'm not saying the court is good, the court is bad. I'm not offering an estimation. I'm just offering a data point that should shatter their model, because most people's models would not predict that or allow that at all. Similarly, so at the federal and state level, in New York City as well, the first thing any legislative body does when it's seated is it selects a head of that body. So usually that's called a speaker. If it's like the New York State Assembly, the Federal House of Representatives, the New York City Council, the speaker, that's the first thing they do. And I think most people would think, oh, well, I know how that goes. The party that has the majority, they're the ones who vote on the speaker. And that's how it always works everywhere, because we're a very polarized nation. And polarized we may be in some respect, but I just don't think most people understand how that works out practically. So in Ohio, which most people would label deep red, very red, I think this is a very low resolution and lacking way to look at the city or the state. They would say it's deep red, and so you say to them, all right, at the top of this year, there's a supermajority of Republicans in the Ohio state legislature. What do you think happened when they picked a speaker? And most people would say, oh, of course, the Republicans picked their Republican person, and that's what happened. That is not what happened. And the Republican caucus broke in half, and half of the Republicans voted with the Democrats in coalition to pick a more moderate speaker. And this kind of stuff, these kinds of model-breaking data points are very regular. Politics, quite simply, is not so simple that it can be distilled in the ways most people want to distill it. It is a far more complex and interesting system than that. So again, I'm not offering any analysis of why that happened in the Ohio State Legislature, or even if it's particularly meaningful. Just the fact that it happened is already enough to break people's models, and to say, like, you should maybe want to look deeper into this if you want to understand what's real, rather than what you've made up in your head.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting to hear you talk about some of these models and how they break. I think of, like, in high school, whenever the presidential election rolled around, there was just all this chatter, like on Instagram, but also in the classroom, people just debating back and forth between the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate. And yet, I think that a lot of our local policy and all of that impacts our day-to-day more than, who's the president for the next 4 years. Transitioning a little bit, you said something like in an alternate reality where they keep building things, housing, trains, etc. The New York City of 2021, okay, I guess this was wherever I pulled this from was kind of dated, but you said the New York City of 2021 has 20 million people, all with a higher standard of living than this timeline, and it is glorious. It's not our present, but it could be our future. So I'm really curious, you have a magic wand. Through Maximum New York, how do you think we can get to that vision of 20 million people with this abundance agenda, living glorious lives? And how does it start with you and Maximum New York?
Well, in some ways we've already talked about, which is just more people need to know how things work, actually, and those people need to be networked together. And the most immediate consequence of that is they form a voting bloc. So they determine who writes laws and who wields hard political power. So if you have a large enough voting bloc, it becomes consequential and people listen. So what I'm working on now, we have elections coming up in 2025. We also do have elections no one knows about in 2024, but we have all of the major offices for New York City are up for election in 2025 and then again in 2029. So the goal here is to give, by 2029 at least, to have trained 10,000 people. The goal here is to give enough people knowledge of how things work actually, that they can coordinate to lift up the correct candidates actually. So right now, in most parts of the city, in many city council districts, etc., you do not have people being driven by a concrete understanding of how things work. And in fact, they are electing representatives who lack basic knowledge. Now, you might then ask yourself, well, how do you know that they lack basic knowledge? How is any citizen supposed to know that? My answer is that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. If you drop somewhere between 1 and 10,000 citizens who understand in depth how all of this works into the city, all of a sudden it is far harder for people to bullshit. Not just politicians, but people just at parties. So in my social spheres, many people have gone through my class and are now working in the civic sphere. We talk about politics all the time. It's not a subject that people shy away from, but they discuss it in the context. It's not imported into the heart of their identity. It's just a pleasant systems problem, and they're trying to think of solutions to it. And then when someone does try to bullshit or talk about it in the overly abstract, unanchored way, they immediately are just like shunted out of the conversation. Or people just don't engage in that way. They just all know to ask for details. They all know which details to ask for. So by teaching, you're not just altering who might be uplifted in an election, you're also fundamentally changing the way politics is received socially. Right now, people are afraid of it. They think it's bad. It's the way that a very primitive mind would regard advanced technology, like scary magic. And like, it's not. It's understandable. It's wieldable. And we can talk about it plainly in a way where no one's threatened, even with regard to weighty issues.
In lieu of a really educated voter base, what do you think makes the biggest difference today in these local elections? How do people get elected?
Well, it depends on election for what in the local context. So in New York City, most city council races are decided in the Democratic primaries because for the most part, the Democrat is going to win the general election in November. So the Democratic primaries are in June. So these things have incredibly low, very low single digit voter turnout rates. So there's a lot of ways to answer the question, how are people elected? One way is to say, well, by pretty much no one. Pretty much no, like in no way can you say that any city council member currently has been elected by anything close to a representative chunk of the population of their district. They will say otherwise. Like, for example, many candidates, even though we only had a single digit voter turnout and the number of votes they got was in the extreme low 4 digits, some of them just in the 3 digits, they'll say, we won a resounding victory, we have a mandate. And you're just like, LOL, no. There's no way. Most people didn't even know you were running. So I think the most important thing for people to realize is officials are elected by pretty much no one. So there's that. So then that opens up an interesting way to look at the future, which is, well, could I raise my own voting block in my own district of just 200 people? What would that take? Why is it hard? Why has it been hard for the incumbent systems to do it? But is there a different way that I could do it? I think, yes, you could. There are different ways of doing it. And if you did do that, you'd probably be able to swing a city council race. Just, again, all this comes down to grasping what is. Like, what are the concrete numbers here in elections? What is actually happening on the ground? No one's voting, etc. So if you can be compelling and raise a new block, that's an interesting affordance. But there's a lot of ways that you could look at this. People are without an educated electorate.
Other than joining Maximum New York and waiting for an election to roll around before they start to mobilize their neighbors, what are some things that people can do tomorrow? I've seen you clean up the streets, maybe, bring your neighbor some cookies and try to get to know your neighbor. I think we talked about how the Venn diagram of politics and community is just a circle. What's that first step look like?
Well, so I always recommend people do a trash pickup for a lot of reasons because of what it leads to, not just because of what it is. So I lead regular trash pickups, and I just go and pick up trash around my block all the time, simply because that's the fastest and easiest way for it to be clean. And if you do it efficiently and have the right tools, it's not a drain on your time. So when people do trash pickups, they experience the psychological phenomenon of agency, of political agency for the first time in the most basic way, which is I personally can change my environment. And a lot of people in New York haven't really felt that before. So, and it's dramatic. If you have a dirty sidewalk, then all of a sudden becomes clean and you know you did it. That's actually kind of intoxicating. So in the first instance, they're granted access to a feeling of agency. And most people feel dispossessed politically. But the kind of quasi-dangerous thing is, as soon as you clean it up, you're going to see someone toss a coffee cup on the sidewalk. And that's the make or break point, because many people, if they don't have someone to turn to talk strategy or something, they will blow up internally. They'll think there's no point. It's just going to go right back to the way it was. And it doesn't, I mean, there's a version of a trash pickup across many different policy domains, but these general points stay the same. You get a taste of agency. You actually want to lean into it. And then you get an immediate reversal and you are tempted to think, what's the point? No one cares. Only I care. And what I usually say to people, because like this happens all the time, you get a coffee, you chill out a little bit, and I say, well, let's back up. I don't think you're the only one who cares. Number one, because like we have people who ran for city council. I think they care, at least. You might not agree with them, but they care, and they stood for election, which is an unpleasant process to go through. They care. And then you can go down the list. So clearly other people care. It's not just you. So don't feel alone. But second of all, ask yourself, did you do what was necessary to create an entirely new trash paradigm on that sidewalk? Do you think you did that in 20 minutes? You did not. It's actually weird that you expect for it to stay clean very long. Now, it shouldn't go back to like 1 week's worth of trash accumulation in a second. But just because you immediately see a new piece of trash, that should be no reason to forsake action in the political realm. You should now start to think to yourself, all right, I didn't do what's necessary to say add new trash cans or change the frequency of sanitation pickups. So I have no logical reason to expect that this is going to be fundamentally different. But now now I will do that. If I actually care about this sidewalk being clean, the next step up is to do what is required to achieve what I would like. And for me, the best thing for a lot of people to do is follow that chain of events, the same ones that you can say happen in trash. Like pick it up, have the dark night of the soul when you see the first piece of trash go back down, and then realize, okay, what is the next step here to do even more than what I just did to get an even better result, an even higher leverage result? And you can do that in many different policy domains and in many different ways. I just think trash pickup's the best one. And it's best to do with your friends because you're outside in the sun getting moderate physical, having moderate physical exertion. You're going to feel nice. Picking up trash is actually way different than most people would expect. But again, ideally, maybe you also invite me to your trash pickup. And then you can ask questions like, well, what is the Department of Sanitation actually? How do I know what their schedule is? What are their rights and responsibilities in this area? How can I change how that works here? So ideally, like I make myself available to as many people as possible when they do stuff like this, because it's one thing to organize yourself and your friends and have a nice time. It's another to have someone on site who can help you lift your eyes to a larger vision and who can answer all the little small administrative questions that are going to pop up. Otherwise, if you don't go through a Maximum New York class or you don't have that person, you're going to face a giant blob of friction in front of you as you try to learn, and it's going to be unpleasant.
Well, as we come to a close here, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us about where Maximum New York is at today and where it's headed, and if people want to get involved, learn more, where can they find it?
I'll also note the way that the sun is going down and the way the lighting. I don't have any lights on in the room, so I'm Ghost Daniel now. But so Up until this point, Maximum New York has been largely one class, the Foundations of New York, the Accelerated Introduction into New York City Government Law. And recently I've started to offer more classes. One of them is a 4-week introduction just into American law, generally speaking, and that's for anyone in the country. That's over Zoom. It's 4 weeks. I've led a couple of sections of that now, which have been very successful. And I have also taught a class on parliamentary procedure. And parliamentary procedure is the internal set of rules that legislative bodies like Congress, the city council, corporations use to govern themselves. So that's another one of those very important, highly consequential, but little known things. It's an example of deep lore in the government. So anyway, all of that is expanding out into a full, I'm calling it a citizen's law degree. It's a sequence of classes that allow people to know in great competent detail from top to bottom how the government works and how they can do things within it in a way that introduces them to actors within the system, allows them to accumulate political capital, etc. So at the top of next year, Maximum New York will have expanded into a full school with multiple class offerings, TAs, etc. There's 100 alumni now who have gone through the class, and the alumni are going to be involved as TAs, in addition to taking more advanced classes now. And as I mentioned earlier, on Monday, I'm kicking off a fundraiser with a low-end goal of $150,000, but obviously there are stretch goals that go up quite a lot, with an ultimate mission of educating 10,000 New Yorkers.
That's awesome. How does
Daniel, when I think about the conversations we've had, whether it's just me reading your Substack or we got coffee or doing this pod, I think it's very refreshing. That's the word that comes to mind. If you asked me maybe a year or two ago, I would be this person that would be using the word politics negatively as a replacement for bad. And I still sense that a lot of my peers, especially people that are just in their tech jobs or in banking or in consulting, many of us still have these biases, but I sense that more of us are becoming more curious and open-minded and also exploratory in how we think about how we live our own lives, putting down roots, building community, trying to understand more of this world outside of this very limited tunnel that we've been in for a while. So it's really refreshing to see you be in the trenches building Maximum New York. And I'm looking forward to coming back to New York in September and organizing a trash pickup. I think the three of us can gather I think we're going to be in 3 different places, so we'll have to settle in a neighborhood, either one of the 3 of ours, or we can find the midpoint and just airdrop in and figure it out.
Yeah,
but
I
think that would be
I'll
a great
go wherever.
Sweet. Well, thanks again for coming on the pod. We will link everything, and yeah, once again, really appreciate it.
That was awesome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.